One punch, 1 second. Todd Bertuzzi facing years in prison. He didn't just end a man's career over a legal hit. He exposed something the NHL didn't want the world to see. But 3 years before that moment, Todd Bertuzzi wasn't a defendant. He was a star. 6'3", 245 pounds, and in the 2002-03 season, he had just been named an NHL First-Team All-Star, the highest individual recognition the league gives a player not holding a trophy. He was the kind of forward defenders genuinely did not want to see coming, because he was skilled enough to score and large enough to make you regret getting in his way. Vancouver had already built an identity around him, and the city treated him accordingly. But Bertuzzi was not the centerpiece of this team. He was the weapon beside one. Marcus Naslund was the captain, the leading scorer in the entire league entering February 2004 with 30 goals and 68 points, and he was Bertuzzi's line mate. Where Naslund provided the finesse, Bertuzzi provided the consequence for anyone who thought about taking advantage of it. That dynamic had made the Canucks one of the most competitive teams in the Western Conference, and the 2003-04 season was shaping up as their best chance to prove it mattered when it counted, with Bertuzzi himself heading into a contract year, meaning every game carried personal financial stakes on top of everything else. What the standings did not show was the temperature inside that locker room. This was a group that had built its culture around protecting its own, and the coaching staff had done nothing to cool that instinct, and would soon do the opposite. When the threat to that culture arrived in the form of a 25-year-old Colorado Avalanche forward named Steve Moore, the response that followed was not spontaneous. It had been building for weeks, and the person who may have lit the fuse was not a player. On February 16, 2004, the Vancouver Canucks traveled to Denver to face the Colorado Avalanche at the Pepsi Center. Steve Moore was a 25-year-old Avalanche forward in his first full NHL season. A checker, not a star. The kind of player who earns his roster spot by doing the work that doesn't show up on the score sheet. What he did that night would follow him for the rest of his life. In the second period, Moore delivered an open ice hit on Naslund as the Canucks captain reached for a puck through center ice, shoulder and elbow to the head, Naslund going down hard. Referee Dan Maruelli watched it happen and called nothing. The league reviewed the play the following day and confirmed the same conclusion. Legal hit, no suspension, no fine. By every official standard the sport had, Moore had done nothing wrong. Naslund left with a concussion and a bone chip in his elbow. He missed the next 3 games. For the Canucks, losing the league's leading scorer for any stretch of time was damaging enough. But it was what came out of the Vancouver locker room in the hours and days afterward that turned a hockey play into something far more serious. Mark Crawford, the head coach, went public immediately, not to acknowledge the ruling, but to demand the referees show respect for the league's leading scorer, framing the no call as an institutional failure rather than a correct decision.
That was a cheap shot by a young kid on a captain, leading scorer in the league, and we get no call. Get no call.
That set the tone. What followed from the players was worse. Brad May, a Canucks forward, told the media that there would, quote, definitely be a price on Moore's head. Bertuzzi called Moore a piece of shit in comments that circulated publicly, then added a line that should have prompted the league to intervene. Games will come, and situations will present itself. There was one more game between these two teams before March 8th, on March 3rd, with Commissioner Gary Bettman in attendance in Vancouver. It ended in a 5-5 tie. 5 days later, the two teams met again, this time without the commissioner watching and without anything left to restrain what had been building for 3 weeks. When a coach and his players make public promises of consequences for illegal play, that stops being locker room culture. That becomes a directive. And the only question left is who carries it out. March 8th, 2004. Colorado Avalanche at Vancouver, General Motors Place. Everyone in that building knew something was coming. The only question was when. The league knew too.
Good offense, but it's 5-0.
At the first intermission, with Colorado already leading 5-0, NHL Executive Vice President Colin Campbell and Director of Officiating Andy Van Helmond called the referees directly to warn them about potential escalation. The sport's own leadership was on the phone mid-game warning officials about what might be coming. The league knew. It did nothing to stop it. In the first period, Moore fought Canucks forward Matt Cook and served his 5-minute penalty. By hockey's own code, that fight settled the debt. The rules are simple. You accept the fight, you take your punishment, it's over. Moore had already done that. What came next had nothing to do with the code. The Canucks were not satisfied. Multiple players continued pursuing Moore throughout the game. Moore declined every attempt to engage. Third period, Colorado leads 8-2. The game has been decided for an hour. Bertuzzi is sent out. He stalks Moore the length of the ice and back, not a confrontation, a chase, and every camera in the building captures it in full. He grabs Moore's jersey from behind. Moore will not turn around. Bertuzzi punches him in the side of the head from behind. Moore is unconscious before he reaches the ice, falling face first onto the surface with Bertuzzi's full weight driving down on top of him. Canucks forward Sean Pronger and Avalanche forward Andrei Nikolitin pile on. Moore does not move. Medical staff reach him immediately, but they don't move him. Not for 10 minutes. In a sport where players routinely get up from hits that would hospitalize normal humans, this was different. A stretcher is brought out. The injuries? Fractured vertebrae at C3 and C4, a grade 3 concussion, and deep facial lacerations requiring sutures. No spinal cord damage. The margin between what happened and something permanent was that thin. Bertuzzi was ejected from the game and suspended indefinitely by the NHL within hours. The Vancouver Canucks organization was fined $250,000, a number that would look almost insulting by the time this story reached its end. 2 days later, on March 10th, Bertuzzi stood in front of cameras at General Motors Place and read a statement. He stopped multiple times, unable to continue.
Steve, I just want to apologize for what happened out there. That I had no intention on hurting you. And I feel awful for what transpired.
He looked directly at no one.
For the kids that watch this game, I'm truly sorry. I don't play the game that way. I'm not a mean-spirited person. And I'm sorry for what happened.
The legal machinery moved more slowly. On June 24, 2004, the British Columbia Criminal Justice Branch formally charged Bertuzzi with assault causing bodily harm. An international arrest warrant was issued, which meant he could not legally travel to the United States, where the majority of NHL arenas are located. The IIHF then extended his suspension internationally, blocking him from playing in Europe during the lockout and barring him from representing Canada in international competition. The IIHF described his actions as an extremely serious violation of the rules that put the sport into disrepute. The defense immediately began arguing that hockey's internal discipline process should govern the matter, that what happened on the ice belongs to the sport, not the courts. The prosecution's position was straightforward. A crime committed inside an arena is still a crime. That argument would define everything that came next. On December 22, 2004, Bertuzzi walked into Vancouver Provincial Court and changed his plea to guilty, avoiding a full contested trial that had been scheduled for January 2005. The charge was assault causing bodily harm. What came next is where the legal system ran into a problem it could not solve cleanly. Crown Prosecutor Garth Lepke laid out the sequence in detail. The stalk, the grab, the punch from behind, and emphasized that none of it was accidental. But then he recommended a conditional discharge. The reason was a legal distinction that ultimately defined the entire outcome. It could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Bertuzzi's actions directly caused the permanent end to Moore's career. The gap between what everyone in the courtroom understood to be true and what the law could actually establish is what collapsed the sentencing. The defense leaned on hockey's own culture as a partial shield. Bertuzzi had not invented this environment. He had operated within one the sport had tolerated and in some cases celebrated for decades. Legal scholars noted publicly that the precedent being set was a significant one. The arena was being treated as subject to different legal standards than any other public space in Canada. The sentence? Conditional discharge, 1 year probation, 80 hours of community service. No prison time, no criminal record. His NHL suspension covered 13 regular season games and 7 playoff games. 20 games total, the fourth longest in league history at the time, stretched to exactly 17 months because of the lockout. He forfeited $501,926.39 US dollars in salary and approximately $350,000 in endorsements. A man that lost his career, his physical future, and his NHL dream in his rookie year. The other man left the court that day with no criminal record. The criminal case was over. The civil case was just beginning. And this is where the question of who actually gave the order acquired legal teeth. Moore filed first in Colorado in February 2005. A judge threw it out, ruling the incident belonged in Canadian courts. On February 16, 2006, the same date as Bertuzzi's first Olympic game with Team Canada, Moore refiled in Ontario Superior Court. The defendants? Bertuzzi, Brad May, Brian Burke, the Canucks organization, and parent company Orca Bay Sports and Entertainment. The suit sought compensation for lost hockey earnings, aggravated damages, and punitive damages. Moore's parents also sued separately for the trauma of watching their son's career end from their home in Ontario. In March 2008, Crawford was added after Bertuzzi filed a third-party claim alleging his NHL contract compelled him to follow his coach's orders and that Crawford should share whatever liability the court assigned. Crawford's formal response was that Bertuzzi had acted in direct disobedience to his instructions to get off the ice. On December 16, 2008, Bertuzzi and Moore met face-to-face for the first time in a court-ordered mediation session. It resolved nothing. Then, in September 2011, Moore's lawyer Tim Danson discovered that Bertuzzi, Crawford, and Orca Bay had secretly negotiated a deal among themselves to share liability without Moore's knowledge. A court later forced the terms into the open. By July 2014, Moore had amended his claim to $68 million Canadian, adding $30 million for lost post-hockey career earnings. He held a Harvard degree and argued that years of post-concussion syndrome had made it impossible to work at the level that education warranted. He told the Canadian press, "I lost my entire career in my rookie year. I can't recover my career, the experience of living out my dream from the time I was 2.5 years old, or playing in the NHL." On August 19, 2014, 10 years, 5 months, and 11 days after the hit, an out-of-court settlement was reached. Confidential. Settled, per Bertuzzi's lawyer, in its totality. 3 weeks before the case was scheduled for trial, meaning the central question, whether Crawford ordered it and whether the Canucks organization sanctioned it, was never put before a judge and jury. It was buried inside a confidentiality agreement instead. Moore wore a neck brace for a year after the incident. He attempted minor league comebacks that went nowhere. He dealt with chronic headaches for the better part of a decade. He eventually earned an MBA from Stanford and built a career in venture capital. 3 questions came out on March 8, 2004 that the legal system never fully resolved. The first, was Bertuzzi acting alone? Brad May publicly announced a price on Moore's head. Under sworn oath, Bertuzzi testified that Crawford pointed to Moore's name and number on the dressing room board during the second intermission and said, he must pay the price. Canucks GM Dave Nonis corroborated this testimony. Crawford denied it. The organization denied it. But the sequence on the ice tells its own story. Cook went first, May 2nd, Bertuzzi 3rd. That is an organized progression, and only one person in that sequence faced any legal consequence. The second, did the law draw the right line? The Crown prosecutor himself acknowledged in court that the permanent end to Moore's career could not be proven as a direct legal consequence of Bertuzzi's actions. That single evidentiary gap produced a conditional discharge and no criminal record for a man whose actions put another man on a stretcher with a broken neck. Identical conduct on a Canadian street results in prison. The third, what actually changed? The NHL strengthened supplemental discipline standards. Concussion protocols were overhauled, partly because of what happened to Moore. Hits from behind drew harder enforcement. Those are real changes. But Crawford went on to coach the Los Angeles Kings and other NHL teams. The Canucks paid a confidential number and issued a statement. The conditions that produced March 8th The public bounty, the coach's alleged dressing room order, the sequential deployment of players against one man who had already answered the call, none of that was ever put on trial. Bertuzzi paid. The system that built the moment never did. Todd Bertuzzi scored 1,159 NHL games, scored 314 goals, and last played in 2014. Steve Moore played 69. He left on a stretcher at 25 and never came back. One man rebuilt his life through Stanford and venture capital. The other rebuilt his career like nothing happened. March 8th, 2004. One night, two completely different endings. If this is the kind of story that doesn't make the highlight reels, but should, Skates and Scars is where they live. Subscribe, because there are more where this came from, and they only get darker from here.